Talk today about international competition in technology and its implications for employment. And I'm going to talk particularly about manufacturing, which, as we shall see in a moment, often involves a lot more than the traditional definition of manufacturing, as Guillermo pointed out to me yesterday. It's become often it involves an integration of biotechnology, materials technology, electronics, digital technology, telecommunications, everything else you can think of. So today we're going to start talking about manufacturing in this broad sense and its implications for jobs and employment all over the world. I'm going to present it's exaggerating to call it a model, I would call it a metaphor of everybody climbing a down escalator moving staircase that's moving down. So if you want to stay steady, you have to run as fast as you can. If you want to get ahead, you have to run even faster. If you prefer a treadmill, that's okay too. 3 consecutive escalators, starting with low income, then medium income, then high income countries. We'll talk about the implication of technological change for each of these. Then we'll talk a bit about China, which I will suggest is trying to climb all 3 escalators at once. The labor-intensive industry, the manufacturing industry, medium tech manufacturing, and climbing up the high-tech industrial escalator as fast as they can manage. Then, by way of overall conclusion, I want to talk about the broader aspects, the broader context, I should say, of science and technology diplomacy. I'll talk briefly about what the economists call global public goods and what we could call more journalistically science for humanity. And then I want to talk about science and technology in the wider world, all of the aspects in which science and technology interact with the world as it is. I'm going to call it science and technology in the global arena. I'm trying to figure out a better way to express it, and where science diplomacy and innovation diplomacy fits in the great scheme of things. So that's the table of contents for today. So let's talk about first the revolution that is both ongoing and oncoming, think locomotive, in advanced manufacturing and its relations with all the other technologies that I described. Well, here are some of the promises that were made by the Obama administration when they set up 15 advanced manufacturing institutes. You can read them as well as I can. Wearable electronics circuits that'll measure your blood pressure. Nanoparticles that will circulate in the bloodstream and tell a diabetic how his or her sugar content is doing. Manufactured biological tissues that will help in wound healing. Lighter, more efficient, less polluting vehicles, because they're made possible by new methods of working with light metals. How's this one? Don't need stoplights anymore, because your car will talk to my car, and your car will know that my car is coming, so you'll stop. Okay. Here's some more. These are more on the factory floor, less consumer-oriented, interactive goggles that will guide a worker through a complicated task that he or she doesn't have to do very often, so isn't used to doing it, needs the instructions in real time. Using 3D printing to speed the fabrication of prototypes. You combine 3D printing with CAD/CAM and with good communications, and you can produce a prototype quickly almost anywhere, or you would be able to, I should say. And this will speed the development of new products, because you can fabricate the the prototypes of possible draft products much more quickly. Using advanced techniques to study chemical catalysis and make the synthesis of chemicals cheaper and more energy efficient. Photonic circuits, replacing or complementing electronic circuits. Better and more efficient switches using wide bandgap semiconductors to improve the reliability and the safety of the electric power grid. Here's another list. Using better sensors and advanced intelligence, artificial intelligence and big data to detect when bridges and buildings and machines need to be repaired or need maintenance much more efficiently than you can do now. Facilitating lifelong learning, doing something similar, spotting product defects on the assembly line. We hear a lot about autonomous vehicles. Probably will start with autonomous shuttles or mining trucks, other vehicles that have to go on predetermined trajectories, so there'll be less judgment involved while the bugs are being worked out. And using blockchain to track the enormous number of parts in some of these supply chains, some of these value networks that we talked about yesterday, to make sure that all the parts are genuine, to check that production standards are being maintained, and again, to manage maintenance. So all this stuff is on the horizon. I'm not talking about cyborgs. I'm not talking about the stuff that's still, at least seems more like science fiction. These are things that many of them will come to pass on a policy-relevant time scale. So the first question is, are there going to be any jobs left? So it's going to be all jobless innovation. We've been through this before. People were worried that the tractors were going to put farmers out of business, that electric power was going to replace horses and that would abolish jobs. The issues go back to the Luddites in the early 19th century. Let's talk, insofar as we can, about the likely implications for employment, both for the high income and the lesser income countries. And what this will mean for the aggregate of labor and what this will mean for particular countries. And secondly, what are the implications for technology transfer? What do countries that are not going to be at the cutting edge of these technologies have to be able to do in order for these technologies to be transferred to them, and so that they can participate in the global economy with high productivity, because it's the high productivity that makes possible high wages. The employer is not going to pay a worker any more than the employer is going to get per worker hour. Okay, well, the short answer is that these technologies are going to be more demanding for everybody. And they're going to demand a better educated workforce. They're going to demand better management. They're going to demand better connectivity. They're going to demand better infrastructure for communication, for transport, and they're going to demand a better business climate. You can think of this as measured by the International Finance Corporation's index of ease of doing business. Roughly the number of permits you have to get in order to start a business. Do you have to go to 20 different offices to get your electric power and your telephone and your this and your that? Or is there a one-stop shop where you can all do it and the tax structure is pretty transparent and so on? So that's the quick summary, but let's unpack it a little bit. These broad challenges take different forms in different countries. And again, I want to suggest this metaphor, which is not supposed to be precise, of three consecutive escalators from low-income country, medium-income country, high-income country, which roughly correspond to levels of technological competence. The high-income country is on the down escalator or the treadmill. They have to keep innovating or they're not going to be able to maintain their high standard of living. The medium-income country needs to master the technology as fast as they can, and hopefully they would like to get on to the third escalator, but just to stay on the second escalator, they have to keep mastering the new technology. The low-income country, again, speaking roughly, needs to learn how to operate these technologies as they come down to them. I understand perfectly well, you understand perfectly well, that technological capability does not correlate perfectly with income. Depends a lot on your natural resource heritage and a lot of other things. But roughly speaking, this is a good way to think about it. And the reason the escalator is going down all the time is these rapid changes in technology and in markets. So let's see what we can do with this picture, bearing in mind that we shouldn't press it too hard. Okay, so first let's talk about it from the point of view of the high-income countries where probably the consequences are somewhat easier to predict. It also happens to be something I know more about, so I'll talk about that first. So what's going to happen to jobs, to employment in a high-income country? Well, some jobs are going to disappear. That's the way it is. Which ones? Well, we don't know exactly. We don't know exactly because we don't know which of the dreams I put to you in those first three slides are going to take place. We don't know their precise application. We don't know what exactly their limitations are going to be, and how they will be developed, what applications will come first, second, and third. So there's a limit to how much we can project, but some things are probably predictable. If a job involves a well-codified rule, even if it's fairly subtle, that can be automated through ordinary automation or through artificial intelligence, this kind of job will probably be eliminated, and the most vulnerable are those in clerical and administrative jobs that even though they are routine and white collar, are quite predictable, or production jobs, again, that are I don't want to be demeaning, that are pretty automatic. But that is going to put higher demands on the more cognitively demanding jobs where you really do need a person, because you need judgment, you need empathy, you need creativity, you need communication skills. And these jobs are likely to be enriched by collaboration with the computer. I'm arguing here from research by David Otter at MIT, which I recommend to you. He's got a very nice TED Talk which summarizes it, and a lot of good articles if you want to go more deeply into it. He cites the example of the impact of automatic teller machines on the employment of tellers. A bank teller is the person behind the screen who used to cash your check and change your money and pay your bills to him or her. So with an ATM, with an automatic teller machine, you'd figure all those people would be out of jobs. In fact, there are now, as Otter points out, there are now more bank tellers in the United States than there were before ATMs were introduced. Why? Well, when you free up tellers from all of this automatic stuff, the cashing of checks or making change or the routine stuff, you make bank operations much cheaper, and you can open up more branches. Then you can upgrade the job of a teller so that the teller is no longer this automatic cash distribution machine. The person that becomes was basically a machine, and make the teller a sales representative for the bank. They call them ambassadors, trying to create personal relationships and so on. Cheaper, so the bottom line is, it's cheaper to open a new branch. There are more branches. More branches need more tellers, even though there are fewer tellers per branch. And the result was that there are now more tellers in the United States than there were 10 or 15 years ago. I wouldn't have guessed that either. There are other cases where the robots are going to assist people in actually doing their jobs. We saw an example at Embraer, where there was a very large piece of the part of an airplane that had to be hoisted just in place. The robot, this is old-fashioned robots, it's not artificial intelligence, picked the thing up, put it in place, and the human worker did the final attachment. And that's a synecdoche, an example of this kind of enrichment in I don't want to say old-fashioned technology, but somewhat less advanced technology. Okay, now, what does this mean, grosso modo, for employment? Well, presumably, these technologies in the aggregate are going to make possible new things, new products, cheaper products, better products. People are going to want more of them. People used to think, why, in 1920 or whatever, with the famous case of the patent director who was supposed to have said, well, everything important has been discovered and everything important has been invented. It turns out that people's desires are insatiable. When you give them something new, they want it. So one figures that these newer, cheaper products are going to create a lot more aggregate demand. People are going to want these things, the economy will grow, and there are going to be a lot of new jobs just from the growth of the economy. All these new things have to be designed and developed and marketed and distributed and then junked in the end. There's a lot of jobs in that. The robots, or whatever, the artificial intelligence machines are going to have to be designed and programmed and reconfigured and fixed when they go wrong, and repaired and managed and junked when they go wrong. So there are going to be jobs. Nobody knows exactly whether there are going to be more jobs or less jobs, but the historic precedents are favorable that there are going to be more of them. But it's pretty clear that they're going to require more education, higher skills, and they're going to require lifelong learning. You're not going to be able to get your BA and your PhD, go out and keep the same job for 40, 50 years. Probably going to have to change your job 2, 3, 4 times, whether we're talking about a worker on the factory floor or a professor for that matter. So, looking at what happened in the United States is instructive and probably predictive, although one never knows. What's happened in the US? Well, you know that there was the Great Recession 7, 8, 9, 10 years ago. What's happened since then? Jobs have been created, but the net creation of jobs in the US, and this is again David Autor's work on labor economics, has the increase in jobs have been those that require more education. There have been an increase in jobs that require no education, and those that require a lot of education. And what's been lost are the jobs in the middle. You have what the economists call a dumbbell-shaped distribution of earnings. That means there's a lot of jobs here, not many jobs in the middle, and a lot of new jobs at higher incomes, requiring higher levels of skill and education. What happened to the guys in the middle, guys of both sexes in the middle? A lot of them migrated to more low-income jobs in healthcare, in security, in hospitality, hotels and stuff, tourism, food services. This is known, again, as a hollowing out of employment. More and better paid high-wage jobs, more low-wage jobs, fewer jobs in between. The technical word for this is skill-based technical change. What does that mean for policy? It means you need a better educated workforce. And again, comparing the US with continental Europe, the US lags behind in this kind of education. And that was why there was a lot of attention to 2- and 4-year community colleges in the US under the previous administration. Ways to keep people up to date with what they need to know because of changes in the economy, changes in technology. We heard references last week to the triple helix, which is quite relevant to this situation. In many cities in the US, where jobs were lost because traditional Rust Belt industries migrated to Mexico or to China, the cities had to reinvent themselves. They had to ask themselves, what do we have left? What skills do we have left? What comparative advantage do we have left? How are we going to reinvent ourselves to attract investment and to revive the city? Because the cities were left bereft and abandoned. And in the most successful of these cities, the triple helix kicked in, if I may mix a metaphor, if you can imagine the triple helix kicking in. It's an interesting metaphor, image rather. And they asked themselves, what is our competence? For example, Akron, Ohio used to be the center of the tire industry. The tire industry went to Southeast Asia, I think. But what remained was a lot of skill in polymer chemistry. And they revived themselves around that. Other places revived themselves around historic tourist attractions, and so on. It required cooperation between the city or the state government, or both, the local educational institutions to train the people that were necessary for the industries where they were hoping to attract, and the business community. If you didn't have this leadership, you were likely to be left behind, leaving behind a very angry and disaffected electorate with political consequences that you may have observed. So overall, you have a net plus. The US economy has been growing rather nicely since the Great Recession, but not everybody has been participating with important political consequences. Okay, so that's the picture in the US, and I think it applies to continental Europe as well, although I'm less familiar with the situation there. The folks here from Europe might be able to fill us in on the situation there and the impact of technological change there. Now, how about the second and third escalators working down, the medium and low income countries? Well, I turn the question around and ask, what do these countries need to do in order to improve themselves, to stay on the escalator they're on, to raise, to make a net upward movement, and maybe to get onto the next escalator if they can? Well, why does it matter? Why does industrialization, why does manufacturing matter? Again, here we need to look at history to give ourselves a framework. The beauty of industry in a largely agricultural country, where most developing countries started, is the higher productivity. And as we said before, higher productivity justifies higher wages. If the employer is getting more out of you per hour, the employer can pay you more per hour. At least that's the theory. If there's serious imbalance between supply and demand, we get into negotiation issues. But that at least is the theory. So the beauty of industry was that it attracted workers from agriculture. As workers left agriculture for industry, it became necessary to mechanize agriculture because you were short of labor. That improved the productivity in agriculture. That's the classic picture of the relations of the agriculture sector and the industrial sector in poor countries. I say classic because this can be changed with economic policies and so on, which will take us the rest of the hour to talk about. The other beauty a second beauty of industrialization is the prospect of skill formation, both in workers and in management, and the more ordinary kinds of industrial discipline, showing up on time, doing what you're supposed to do, learning your skill, and so on. The other beauty of industry is that it is quickly scalable. If you have access to global markets, you can rapidly increase your scale. You can take advantage of economies of scale, again raising labor productivity. Typically, industrialization takes place in cities. People tear their hair about the problems of traffic congestion and pollution. But for many purposes, the city is a very efficient way to deliver services, if you want to deliver services. If you don't want to deliver them, then they don't happen. But if you want to, the people are more closer together. You can educate the kids. You can provide water. You can provide health services, and so on. And the internet has a particular virtue that if you're a small business, you can reach global markets more quickly by advertising on the net. It used to be that it was very difficult for a small business somewhere in a medium-income country to reach global markets. Because of the difficulties of global marketing, it's much easier now on the net. So, what are the basic challenges of a medium-income country? Well, a lot of them are natural resource-based. If that's the case, one needs to diversify, need to integrate into these global value chains that we talked about yesterday, need to improve elementary and high school education, which is typically a big problem in many of these countries, upgrade workforce education and lifelong learning, which is a problem that everybody shares, because that area tends to have been neglected in most countries, although not all of them. Various problems with the business climate, all kinds of bureaucratic regulations that are needed to encourage investment, to protect intellectual property if you're trying to attract the latest technology, and to enable competition, which may mean fighting vested interests that have been protected from competition, either foreign or domestic, for a long time. And we've heard a lot about the need to support research, to support innovation and the diffusion of technology and technical support services that we talked about yesterday, the science, technology, and innovation system. There are typically barriers to innovation which need to be explored. Some of them are overall, and some of them are specific to particular sectors. If you're trying to attract investment, and when I say investment, I mean both foreign and domestic investment, to a particular sector, you need to ask yourself systematically, what's blocking innovation and progress in this sector? And sometimes the barriers seem to be quite removed from the actual sector. We talked about the importance of portable pensions. Who would have thought portable pensions are important? And finally, you want to make sure that this increased economic growth doesn't take place at the expense of your environment and doesn't take place at the expense of your workers' safety, so that the people who are paying a large part of the cost are the people who are involved in industrial accidents or fires or other ways in which individuals without a safety net suddenly have their lives ruined because they're of poor environment, with health costs of poor environment or health costs of bad worker safety. Okay, now let's talk briefly about the problems of low-income countries. These countries have a particular problem because to the extent that they've been able to industrialize, it's been on the basis of their low labor costs. The problem is that labor costs aren't what they used to be. Most of these technologies that we're talking about, not just the ones that were still dreams in the first sectors, but the technologies that have come in the last 10 or 20 years are less labor intensive. They're more capital intensive. So labor costs are less important, and low labor costs are less important than they used to be. And this is already apparent in the statistics. There's a phenomenon called premature deindustrialization. God help the people who think of these names. But the idea is that in the ancient days of 30 or 40 years ago, a low-income country would maintain a reasonably high proportion of its industry up to a certain level of income, and then it would shift away towards services. And this level of income at which the deindustrialization, which the shift of the proportions of GNP shift from industry to services, has been going down. In other words, a country loses its industry at a lower level of income than it used to. Now, some of this may be a statistical artifact because if you have if people who keep the statistics look at manufacturing industry, and if the manufacturing industry does its own payroll, that's part of manufacturing when you do your economic macro statistics. And now if you outsource it to an independent consulting firm or accounting firm, it's services, it's not industry anymore. But the statisticians do their best to correct for this. Well, what does this mean globally? Well, the people in poor countries, in the low-income countries, that used to maintain their job in labor-intensive industries longer than they used to as their wages went up, suddenly may find that the jobs aren't there anymore. And they'll go somewhere where the jobs are. Now, we've already seen what happens when large numbers of migrants come to countries where the jobs are. You get various social and political complications. Take this skill-based technical change, add in climate change that's going to hurt agriculture in a lot of countries in which agriculture is already marginal. I'm thinking African countries, but there are probably a lot of others. And you have the recipe for very substantial demographic changes with very substantial political implications. So my suggestion is that this is a global problem that requires a good deal more attention than it's getting. Okay, now, we need to talk about China, and then I want to conclude with the other remarks. Main thing about China is it's climbing all three escalators at once. It's the second largest economy in the world. It's intimately integrated into the world economy. It's the world center of export manufacturing. It's lifted hundreds of millions of people from poverty. That's one big accomplishment. It's a major market for natural resources, which has been a main source of growth in a lot of low and medium income countries. It's been an agile absorber of foreign technology, some of which it's gotten legitimately, and some of which it's gotten less legitimately. And it is making ambitious plans. It's made ambitious investments in education and research, ambitious plans in basic science, and for leadership in cutting-edge innovation. And it's making technological exports to complement a very important geopolitical vision. And of course, China's had a very tough history in the last 200 years vis-a-vis foreign colonial countries, so one can understand where they're coming from psychologically. Well, you can see what this means for our three escalators. China is really very good at managing labor-intensive, traditionally labor-intensive technologies. They still have a substantial amount, a population of agricultural people that can be labor that can be absorbed into industry. And as the wages are going up, they can shift their labor labor-intensive industries from the eastern frontier to western China, which is still somewhat undeveloped. And if that doesn't work, there's all of Southeast Asia. And you can see that this is happening in response to this tariff business that's in the paper. As far as the second escalator is concerned, the Chinese are really, really good at scaling up manufacturing. In collaboration with the Taiwanese, they are the major manufacturer of high-tech products like iPhones. The iPhone couldn't be manufactured anywhere else. That whole technological capability, the whole technological ecosystem has migrated to Taiwan and to China to support that kind of manufacturing, and this is only one example. In fact, one of the major purposes of the Obama initiative was to bring back some of that, that technology and some of that ecosystem and employment back to the US. They're really good at re-engineering products to maintain not all of the quality, but the essential product for low-income markets. Medical instruments, motorcycles, a wide variety of re-engineered products that they do very well, and they scale up manufacturing. There's an MIT paper called Scale Up Country, which lays this all out. And they're really good at building infrastructure. If you look at the topography of China and you realize how the kind of territory over which they're building railroads and tunneling highways and so on, you get a lot of respect for their engineering capability, and that's an export item. And they're very good at renewable energy. They're for windmill and solar and so on. So they're quite good on the second escalator. And they have big plans for the third escalator. They're supporting basic research. There's still bugs in the system, but they're more and more good papers are coming out of China, often in collaboration with other countries. And they've announced a major program to be leaders at the cutting edge of what they have chosen as 10 critical technologies in a famous paper released with a lot of ballyhoo called Made in China 2025. Now, if we're going to get to lunch, I don't want to talk too much about the internal context of China. You have a billion people. You have a lot to talk about. So you can read the slide. I think it's going to be on the line. What I should say is that when you have a market that size, you attract a lot of investment. You're expanding your capital investment, and you get a lot of the latest technology just because when people are investing, they put the latest technology in. They've also been able to provide a seamless retail experience because of the merger of various technologies. For business reasons it'll take too long to go into, but basically there are niches that a Chinese company can spread into, which if they tried it in America, they'd have trouble because somebody's already there. There's already a Facebook and a Google and an Amazon and so on. China, there wasn't, so one company could spread itself out. So you can go to China now. I understand I haven't done this myself, but you take your biometric and you can buy a hamburger with it, and the money will come right out of your bank account. That's also very handy technology for surveillance, so it has other non-commercial applications, and so the government is probably happy to see this technology developed. And so we have a country that has geopolitical ambitions and major technological ambitions. This has resulted in some worries on the part of more advanced countries, especially since some of these surveillance technologies are quite suited to other authoritarian countries and could be the basis for a geopolitical expansion. A lot of countries who would like to see better control over their populations. Well, this has excited a certain pushback, and I'm not here to say whose fault it is. you can read about it in the newspapers and make your own decisions. My feeling is that that some of it would have happened anyway, and some of it would have been exacerbated by the personalities involved and the politics involved. But I leave that for you to judge. Anyway, what is clear for purposes of this school is that technology is right at the center of what you read about in the papers, these trade and tariff arguments between the US and China. And to come back to the narrower definition of science diplomacy, these things are having direct effect on student and faculty exchanges and research collaboration. So these broader issues are coming home to roost, even on the direct subject of this school. More broadly, if this thing gets out of hand, and it's not clear yet whether it will or not, but it's worrisome, it could lead to competing trade blocs. I used to think two, maybe more than two, who knows? Competing internets, who knows? Because there are serious issues about freedom of information. There are a large number of countries that consider that the original intent of the internet, that anybody can get on it, that anybody can put an app on it. There are countries that don't like the freedom of information, other countries that don't much care for the freedom of innovation. And it's not only, everybody has something they don't want on the net. There are countries that don't want religious information, countries that don't want political information, some that don't want gambling, some that don't want pornography. Nobody wants a purely open internet. And you can see what the international negotiations of that subject will look like and who's going to make that decision. But I think it's pretty clear that if you get these competing internets, you get these such competing trade blocs, it's not good for world growth. The system that has been developed since World War II, whatever its flaws, and there certainly are flaws, has given us relative absence of a major war, continued economic growth. It's really a system that's worth defending. It's in nobody's interest, but it's not clear what's going to happen. Now, I've got a few minutes left that I'd like to deal with some broader issues having to do with the context of science and innovation diplomacy. And I gather last week there were some discussions on this, which I didn't hear, but I want to put in my 2 cents. First of all, let's talk a bit about this question of science for humanity, which I think is one of the motivations for this school and one of the motivations why people come here to talk about the importance of the mechanisms of science, scientific cooperation. I think people here, and people in this room, have one way or another, more or less, their motivation is that, look, I've studied all this science, or I've studied all this social science. I'm here to make a difference in the world. And I have the feeling that the mix of science and technology on the one hand, and the stuff I've been learning, and the stuff I'm learning here, are going to help me make a difference. I don't mean me, I mean you. Make a difference of one kind or another. So what does it mean to have science for humanity? Well, there's a lot of ways that you can have science for humanity, but I want to talk specifically about global public goods, which is economic jargon, again, bloodless jargon, I have to say, for things that belong to nobody and are available to everybody. There are fancier ways to say that, but that's basically what it means. And coming back to the idea of the international innovation system, that's one of the things you want from the international innovation system. You don't just want the innovation system to produce cheaper consumer goods. You want it to handle the big issues that are confronting humanity: environment, poverty, public health, freedom from pandemics, cybersecurity, regular security, and so on. Climate change, too. Don't forget that one. Okay. So I want to talk about a few initiatives which illustrate how science and technology is in fact addressing some of the global problems, There are many more. These are just ones that I happen to know something about. What they all have in common is at some stage of the game, they require public involvement. There was a famous book called The Fortune at the Bottom of the Pyramid by an Indian American named Prahalad, unfortunately deceased now, that argued that you could make a lot of money if you designed products for the people at the bottom of the pyramid, people with the lowest income. When you examined his examples, private industry was very active in developing these products, but almost without exception, somewhere in the path from the product to the consumer, there was some public money, either from government or from private foundations. The biggest of these programs is the Program of International Agricultural Research Centers. I think the current budget is $850 million a year. That's a lot of money. 15 international agricultural research centers all over the world producing technologies for smallholder farmers involving virtually all of the major food crops of the world. That's by far the most important scientific and technological effort on behalf of low-income people. It's financed by aid agencies and private foundations from all over the world. It's an extremely valuable international effort. Now, this has its origins in the Green Revolution, which began by increasing the productivity of wheat and corn and rice, and which arguably saved the world from major famine 30 or so years ago. The Green Revolution was a major technological advance. Food is a lot cheaper now worldwide than it would have been in the absence of the Green Revolution, but it's had its criticism. At the beginning of the Green Revolution, fertilizer, pesticide use was very, very low. The people who were promoting the Green Revolution figured, look, it's so low now, we're really not going to worry about the environmental consequences. The issue is to get it higher. Well, it's 50 years later now, and the environmental consequences have come home to roost with lower water tables, pollution from fertilizer and pesticide, and so on. So there's an important pressure for more sustainable agriculture, lower input agriculture. Problem from the institutional point of view about sustainable low input agriculture is it tends to be very locality specific. The whole idea of the International Agricultural Research Centers was that you develop a variety that can be used anywhere in the world. It's adapted by the National Agricultural Research Center and then spread throughout the country. If you want sustainable agriculture with low inputs, you have to be a lot more micro-oriented. Enter a very interesting NGO called Digital Green, which trains local people to make videos of sustainable agriculture suited in the local language, suited to the local situation. A very interesting innovation which addresses a very important problem that's very hard for this is an NGO, a non-governmental organization, be very hard for governments to do this, and this NGO is tackling an important problem and is already working on a very substantial scale in India and in other countries. If you want to learn more, just go to Digital Green on the web. Neglected tropical diseases. I'm going very quickly over these things to give you an idea of what the scope of the problems and the scope of the people who are trying to address them are. Maybe 1 billion people have malaria or schistosomiasis in the world. Most of them are very poor. 1 billion people with no money. 1 billion people times 0 is 0. It's not a commercial market. It's not a market that is attractive to a drug company that wants to invest in developing a vaccine or a cure which costs hundreds of millions of dollars. Enter the foundations, enter the National Institute of Health, which has spent a good deal of money developing a malaria vaccine, developing other cures and vaccines for these neglected tropical diseases, of which there are a fair number. There are also some private companies that are working on trachoma and other diseases. In other cases, private companies have donated medicines. For example, there's a terrible disease in the African Sahel called river blindness, spread by a fly. It's a nematode infection that makes you blind by the age of 30 if you're trying to farm in the only decent agricultural lands in these countries. The Merck company has donated many doses of a medicine that was originally fed to veterinary medicine, but it turns out to be very effective against this disease, and combined with spraying of the place where the fly vector multiplies, has reduced this disease to a very tiny fraction of what it used to be. And there are similar efforts in another terrible disease called guinea worm that was from the Carter Center in Atlanta, working again with the DuPont company. There are other areas where private companies have developed innovations or innovative campaigns. The Lever brothers the Lever company in India had a hand washing campaign. Wash your hands after you go to the toilet and so on. Of course, they sell more soap that way, but it's an important public health thing. There was an inventor in Paris, in France, that invented a peanut-based food for kids who come in an advanced state of malnutrition from a refugee situation, for example, or a wartime situation. It keeps well, it's tasty, the kids will eat it, and you can get them from a very seriously malnourished situation to a healthy situation in a month or two. Totally different field, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, a voluntary group of 3,000 scientists, all of them qualified in one area or another relevant to climate change. Every half dozen years they put out a set of reports that are that high and that big about the state of science about climate and about the state of economic and geographic science about its regional impacts. And I think we mentioned yesterday in the discussion a number of non-governmental organizations in India that are addressing the issue of blindness from cataracts and amputations. The amputees in India tend to be younger. If you're broke and you want to get from one city to another in India, maybe you'll ride on the roof of the train rather than buy a ticket and sit inside the train. That you'll get there, but if you're not lucky, you'll fall off, and if you fall off, your chances are not bad of losing a leg. So the bottom line is that an amputee in India is likely to be younger and more demanding of a prosthesis than an older person in an advanced country that's likely to be a 70 or 80-year-old diabetic and not as demanding in the performance. Now, I want to spend a couple of minutes on the broader context of science and innovation diplomacy, which is a subject that's near to my heart. There are a number of academic disciplines that ask important contextual questions about the impact of the international impact of science and technology. One of them is science and innovation diplomacy, that is the subject of this course. One is national science and innovation policy. There's a very well-established field called science and technology studies, and there's science, technology, and international affairs. And each of these fields has a piece of the action. Each of these is addresses a part of the very complicated interaction between science, technology, and the larger world. And when you start from one of them, you inevitably pull in ideas from the other. We've already seen how the subject of science and innovation diplomacy, which sounds like something narrow, but when you actually look at it, you start getting broader and broader and broader. And each time you have to come back and say, hey, what's the diplomatic aspect of this thing? But it's clearly getting into a broader universe. So let's look at each of these fields and ask what they mean when you take the words literally, when you actually believe in the meaning of the words as opposed to what is the subject that they're trying to get at. Well, science and innovation diplomacy, I don't think I have all elements here. Scientific advice to foreign ministries. Science advice to the diplomatic process. Science and technology aspects of negotiations. That's one clear meaning within the words science and diplomacy, because diplomacy is what diplomats do. Or scientists acting as diplomats. You're trying to develop an international institution like the Sesame that you learned about last week. There are diplomatic aspects. The scientists have to interact with each other. They have to interact with governments. The scientists become diplomats, and the diplomats work with scientists. Or you can use your science as an element of what they call soft power. Soft power is trying to get people to decide what you want them to decide without forcing them to, without invading them or oppressing them economically. So you send your Nobel laureate to give lectures. And the receiving country is delighted to hear the Nobel laureate and thinks better of you, of your country. Or scientific collaboration as a way of cementing good relations. The countries are already friendly, but now the scientists improve on these good relations. Or the relations are terrible. North and South Korea hardly talking to each other. The US and Soviet Russia during the height of the Cold War, hardly talking to each other. So the North Korean and the South Korean and the American scientists study North Korean volcanoes. Everybody's interested in the volcanoes, right? Or the Israelis and the Palestinians and the Jordanians talk about the Jordan River watershed. They've got to talk about the watershed. They share the water. Sure, it's political, but they still have to talk to each other. So these are the narrow meanings of the words science and innovation diplomacy. Let's look at some of these other things. Science and technology studies, of which there are many academic departments in the US and Europe, and I'm sure in other countries as well. I just don't know them as well. This is centered on a number of subjects: the history of science and technology, the sociology of science, the ethnography of science. An anthropologist goes into a laboratory and observes it as if it were a strange tribe in New Guinea. I hope there's nobody here from New Guinea that I don't mean to be insulting about New Guinea. It's a wonderful country. I visited it. The philosophy of science, the public understanding of science. Do people understand public attitudes towards science? How does scientific information spread? The social impact of science, the social impact of technology, the bicycle, the public conceptions of technology, the history of the bicycle. Is it efficient transportation, or is it a sign of masculinity, a sign of how much danger you're going to get, or is it a way of freeing up women so that they can travel freely? It's been all of these. That's the kind of thing the STS people study. It's very interesting stuff. But again, it's only a piece of the action. Science and public policy. Now we're getting into the nuts and bolts of how policy impacts science, and how science impacts policy, and how science raises issues that policymakers have to deal with. So we have research policy, which are the policies that control research. How much money is going to go for physics? How much for biology? How much for IT? How do you enforce the standards against plagiarism, against department directors abusing abusing the people under them, or the balance between project finance and overall finance to facilities? The nuts and bolts that keep science going. Innovation policy that we've talked about a lot here. How do you encourage? How do you encourage innovation? How do you remove obstacles to innovation? IP rights, and various policy issues that affect science. What's the moral status of the embryo? How do cultural feelings about abortion affect research on embryology, or the use of embryos in research on development, that kind of thing. Finally, let's talk briefly about science, technology, and international affairs, which is the thing that's closest to my heart, since that's the program I developed at Georgetown. This talks about or addresses the links between science and technology on the one hand, and a lot of other disciplines on the other. Law, politics, economics, culture, business, a lot of other things. And typically one looks at particular sectors, and there's a whole list of them here: environment, climate, energy, security, competitiveness. All of these are areas which have a scientific and technological dimension, a scientific and technological core, but which involve a lot of other things: economics, politics, business, law, culture, a lot of other stuff. And typically, although not always, other disciplines maybe bring in the science, but remember, for example, that your economic policies are not handed down from the heavens. They were not dictated on Mount Sinai. They came from political considerations. So you really have to consider the politics and the economics and the culture and the technology, and technology is one dimension. To see how this works, I want to bring you back to my first experience when I became the science advisor to the World Bank, which was a whole new thing. Nobody knew, including me, exactly what the science advisor would do. And my first assignment was to look at the question of nutrition for historical reasons. Okay? And this was the beginning of my education. I'm a biochemist by training and a chemical physicist, so the first thing I did when I was asked to look into this, I went to my biochemistry textbooks and I learned all about vitamins and minerals. I could tell you a lot about cofactors and biochemical catalysts. And that's when I started to learn. Well, who's going to make advice on nutrition? The scientist said, well, you better increase your consumption of protein, calories, and micronutrients. And at the time, the kwashiorkor, or serious malnutrition, was a serious problem. Well, then I started to learn. The Economist says that hunger is a matter of money. You can starve perfectly well outside a grocery store if you don't have any money. It's not a matter of not having enough food. There's food. But if you don't have any money, you can't buy this stuff. So the politician says, well, make food cheaper. The agriculturalist says, increase production. So you get an increase in support to agricultural research. The food technologist says, of the food that's created, look at the percentage that's wasted. We need better storage. We need better refrigeration. The economist generally looks and says, well, there are economic reasons for that. The educator says, the problem is that people don't understand nutrition very well. They buy the wrong stuff. They eat the wrong stuff. We have to improve their understanding. Family sociologist looks at the family and says, Daddy gets all the food. Daddy's the breadwinner. When food is scarce, Daddy gets the food. The mommy gets the next, and the kids gets what's left over. No wonder the kids are malnourished. Public health guy says, well, the food's coming in, but it's also going out because of diarrheal diseases. We have to cure that. Kid who's sick isn't going to eat. He's going to be he or she's going to be malnourished. The soldier says, well, the problem is that there's really enough food, but famine is used as a weapon of war. And that's the big problem. The laws of war should prohibit this, and they should be enforced. You get the idea. The marketer says, well, the problem is in low-income neighborhoods, there's no grocery store. So people eat lousy stuff because they can't get fruits and vegetables. Infrastructure says, well, you need better transport. You need barriers to trade. So what I'm getting at is that if you're asking, how do you apply science and technology to broader issues and to the issues, some of the great issues that face us, you're being asked to look at science and technology in a much broader context, with a much against the context which involves at least some insight into a very large number of disciplines. I've used malnutrition, but we could have done the same thing with nuclear, with practically any of these things, with health, with internet, with information. All of these involve a core of science and technology, an important dimension of science and technology, but a lot of other stuff also. Okay, so the bottom line is that this complexity of nutrition issues is typical of the great global problems in which science and technology are essential dimensions. And notice I'm using the plural. Science and technology are different. That's where we started yesterday. So the bottom line is that science and innovation diplomacy are an important element, but are not the only element of a broader subject. And Professor Ari and I were over a long lunch on Saturday trying to figure out, is there a word, is there an umbrella term that would allow us to capture this whole thing, this whole subject that we have been talking about? And I'm still searching for it. The best thing I can come up with is something that a dean suggested to me when I was first starting the overall course in the program in Science, Technology, and International Affairs. Science and technology in the global arena. Arena is not a bad metaphor, because you can have a bullfight in an arena, you can have a basketball game, you can have a commercial exhibition, you can have an American football game, or a much more decorous soccer game, and so on. I thank you very much for your patient listening, and I'm interested in your discussion.